Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a mystery that, even years later, still baffles everyone involved. The disappearance of Jimmy is a case that's left an eerie silence in its wake. And as you settle into your comfy spot, I want you to imagine the quiet streets, the hidden corners of a small town, and the young man who vanished without a trace. You can almost feel the weight of the unknown, can't you? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Share your location and local time in the comments below, and we can all feel a little more connected as we embark on this journey together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Jimmy was a regular guy, living in a quiet town, known by everyone, but still somehow a mystery to himself. A few days before his disappearance, he had been acting a little off. Something wasn't right. His friends had noticed, but they didn't think much of it. After all, people go through things. They'd figured he'd be fine, that he would snap out of it, like he always did. But that wasn't how it played out. The last time anyone saw Jimmy, he was just a few steps from his home. It was a calm evening, one of those nights where the air is still and the stars are too bright for the streetlights to fight them off. Jimmy was walking down the road, hands in his pockets, his head down. He seemed normal, but something about it didn't sit right with the person who happened to glance out their window. They couldn't quite place it. And then, just like that, Jimmy was gone. No struggle, no sign of trouble, just vanished, as if the night itself had swallowed him whole. People started to talk, of course. They were worried. His family, frantic, called the authorities, but no one could find any trace of him. Not a footprint, not a single clue. But then came a phone call. It wasn't long after he left home. Just minutes. The call came from his phone, except it wasn't Jimmy on the other end. It was someone who barely said a word. Just a few breaths, a faint shuffle of movement, and then the line went dead. The police were quick to investigate, but there was nothing unusual about the call. It was hard to trace, just one of those strange, unexplainable events that happens when a case is already so baffling. What was even stranger was that it was never mentioned by Jimmy himself. No one knew about that call until it was too late. There were no leads, and even the people closest to Jimmy had no idea why he would leave or where he'd gone. The case quickly became one of those that you read about in true crime books. One of those that makes you wonder about the strange, unpredictable nature of the world. But the thing about mysteries like this is that they don't just disappear. No, they linger, like a shadow you can't quite get rid of. The search began almost immediately, a wave of concerned friends and family fanning out across the town. They knocked on doors, asked neighbors, retraced Jimmy's steps, but it was like looking for a needle in a haystack. The town, usually so quiet and calm, was now a hive of activity, buzzing with questions and worry. Everyone had their own theory. Some thought he had just run away. Others whispered about darker possibilities. But the one thing no one could ignore was how unremarkable everything seemed. There were no signs of struggle, no broken windows, no signs that anything had gone wrong. It was as though Jimmy had simply decided to step out of his life without leaving a trace. The authorities were quick to step in, but even their resources didn't bring any answers. Jimmy's parents were beside themselves, trying to stay calm while still desperately searching for any clue. They scoured the town and surrounding areas, but nothing turned up. No one had seen anything. It was as if he had disappeared into thin air. One evening, as the search seemed to be hitting a wall, a new theory began to take shape. A few people had seen someone around the time of Jimmy's disappearance, but not Jimmy, someone else. A man, perhaps in his 30s, dark-haired and tall, walking briskly in the direction Jimmy had gone. A man who didn't seem to belong. This sighting was small, almost insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But for those involved, it was a glimmer of hope, a thread to pull on. Maybe Jimmy had met this man. Maybe they were connected in some way. Maybe he wasn't alone when he vanished. But this was where the story started to get a little strange. The woman who had seen the man didn't quite trust her own memory. She was unsure if it had even been the same day or the same place. And of course, no one else had seen this mysterious figure. The police couldn't confirm it. It was just another thing to add to the ever-growing list of maybes that seemed to follow the case. And so the weeks passed. The search slowed, but the questions never stopped. Everyone had their theories, but no one had the answers. But then, as the case began to fade from the headlines, a new development came. A tip came in, an anonymous call, much like the one Jimmy had received. This one was more specific, though. It mentioned a place, a small town on the outskirts of the state, about 2 hours away. A place that no one had considered before. And that's where we'll pick up next. The anonymous tip was a beacon of hope, yet another tiny thread to grasp at. It wasn't much, but it was something. The voice on the other end of the line didn't say much, only that if they looked hard enough, they might find Jimmy somewhere in a town called Corbin's Hollow, just outside the city limits. No one knew much about Corbin's Hollow. It was small, a place on the map that even the locals tended to forget existed. The streets were quiet, the kind of place where people went to disappear or maybe just to be forgotten. It seemed like an unlikely place to find Jimmy, but it was a lead. The authorities weren't sure what to make of the tip. After all, how could they be sure it wasn't just another hoax? It wasn't uncommon for people to make false claims in high-profile cases like this, trying to get attention or stir things up. But there was something about this tip that felt different. It wasn't sensational, no wild claims or dramatic stories, just a simple mention of a location. So, the search continued, this time with a slight shift in direction. A group of volunteers, including some of Jimmy's closest friends, packed up and set out for Corbin's Hollow. The drive was long, the landscape unfamiliar, but they pressed on, determined to find something, anything, that could shed light on Jimmy's disappearance. As they entered Corbin's Hollow, the atmosphere shifted. There was something eerie about the place. It wasn't exactly threatening, but there was a certain heaviness in the air, as if the town itself was holding its breath. The buildings were old, worn down, and everything about it felt still. Time didn't seem to move quite as quickly here. The people, if they were even around, were quiet, unresponsive to the newcomers who had come to ask about Jimmy. It wasn't long before they came across a small, nondescript house at the edge of town. It was the only building that stood out, not because it was particularly striking, but because it seemed out of place in such a quiet and neglected town. The windows were shut tight, and there was an unsettling quiet around it. Jimmy's friends couldn't help but feel that this house might hold something, some clue, or maybe just another strange coincidence in a series of them. As they knocked on the door, no one answered. No one even came to the window to peer out. It felt like the house had been abandoned, even though there were no signs of it. A chill ran down their spines as they stood there, wondering if this would be another dead end, or if they had stumbled upon something important. But it wasn't long before a man appeared, middle-aged, with tired eyes, but otherwise unremarkable. He didn't seem surprised by their visit, as if he had been expecting them. When asked if he knew anything about Jimmy, he merely shook his head, but his hesitation was telling. Something in his eyes flickered for just a moment, like he was trying to decide whether to speak. But before anyone could press further, he closed the door almost too quickly. They stood there for a moment, unsure of what to make of the encounter. The man hadn't said anything, but the way he acted, the way he looked, suggested that he knew more than he was letting on. It wasn't much, but it was the first real hint of something that didn't quite add up. And as they left the house, A question hung in the air. Was this man connected to Jimmy's disappearance? Or was he just another dead end in a case full of them? The man's strange behavior haunted Jimmy's friends as they left Corbin's Hollow, their thoughts swirling with questions that had no answers. Why had he acted that way? Why had he closed the door so quickly, almost as if he was trying to hide something? They hadn't gotten any answers from him, and yet something about that brief encounter didn't sit right. But they couldn't linger there forever. Time was precious, and Jimmy's disappearance had already consumed so much of it. As they drove back, the quiet streets of Corbin's Hollow seemed to mock their frustration. The mystery felt heavier than ever, like a thick fog that refused to lift. They didn't return to Corbin's Hollow right away. The lead had fizzled out, and the house was just another strange moment in a case that was filled with them. Still, the oddness of it lingered, like an itch they couldn't scratch. Could this man have known something? Could he have been involved in some way? There were no answers, only more questions. A few weeks later, a breakthrough came, though it wasn't from the police or the volunteers. It came from an unexpected source. A local reporter who had been following the case uncovered an old connection between the man in Corbin's Hollow and someone from Jimmy's past. A person from his high school days. It was nothing earth-shattering, but it was enough to reignite the search. The man's name was Carl Weaver. He was a former classmate of Jimmy's, someone who had drifted in and out of his life, but had always kept to himself. They hadn't been close, but they had known each other. The reporter discovered that Carl had recently moved to Corbin's Hollow, and this connection, though tenuous, was enough to warrant a deeper look. The investigation now had a new direction. Carl Weaver became a person of interest, even if there was no clear reason to suspect him. Yet, the timing of his move, his apparent connection to the small town, and his odd behavior when Jimmy's friends had knocked on his door, it all felt like a coincidence too strange to ignore. But there were still so many unanswered questions. Why had Carl left the area in the first place? And what had drawn him back to this quiet, isolated town? What role, if any, did he play in Jimmy's disappearance? Jimmy's friends couldn't help but wonder if Carl knew more than he was letting on. As the days passed, the case seemed to grow colder, and yet there was still something pushing them to keep going, to keep digging. The mysteries surrounding Jimmy's disappearance seemed to spiral, becoming ever more tangled and complex. Every time they thought they had found something solid, it slipped away like trying to hold on to smoke. But just when it seemed like they might never get any closer to the truth, an unexpected clue surfaced, one that would change the direction of the case entirely. The new clue came in the form of a peculiar photograph, one that appeared in the mailbox of Jimmy's mother one rainy morning. It wasn't signed, and there was no note attached, just the image itself. A blurry, grainy photograph of a place Jimmy had visited years ago, a small cabin by the lake outside of town. The image was taken at night, and the shadowy figures in the foreground weren't clearly identifiable, but it was unmistakably the lake, Jimmy's favorite spot. The photo was unsettling for several reasons. First, it seemed too coincidental. The cabin had been a place Jimmy visited often, a retreat from the stresses of life. But it was a place he hadn't visited for months, maybe even a year. Why would someone send this photo now? The second unsettling thing was the faint silhouette of a person standing near the cabin. The figure's outline was hard to make out, but the posture was distinct, like someone waiting. It almost looked like Jimmy himself. But how could this photograph have been taken so recently? At first, Jimmy's family was hesitant to believe the photo meant anything. After all, it could have just been a prank. But the more they looked at it, the more they realized something strange. The person in the photo seemed to be watching the cabin, standing still as if waiting for something or someone. Theories began to swirl around the image. Could have been taken the night Jimmy disappeared. Was it possible he had gone back to that cabin, only to be followed? Or had someone taken the photo long before, perhaps even stalking him in secret? The question that lingered was why. Why had this photo been sent to them? And why now, when the case was growing colder by the day? The authorities were notified, and the photo was carefully examined. They were able to trace the photograph's origins, though the results were not as helpful as they had hoped. The sender was still unknown, and there was no way to confirm whether the figure in the photo was really Jimmy or someone else entirely. Yet, despite the lack of answers, there was an undeniable sense that the photograph held something important. It was a glimpse into a part of the mystery that had never been fully explored, and it raised more questions than it answered. Jimmy's friends and family returned to the lake, hoping that this photo could be the key to finding him. The search expanded once more, this time with a renewed focus on the cabin and the surrounding area. But the lake, like everything else in this case, was vast and silent, its waters hiding secrets that were still too deep to uncover. The renewed search around the lake and cabin felt almost like a ritual now. Every brush of wind through the trees seemed to carry the weight of unanswered questions. It was as though the landscape itself was holding its breath, waiting for someone to discover the truth. The volunteers scoured the area for hours, retracing Jimmy's past steps, even though the thought of finding him seemed as far off as ever. The lake, tranquil and expansive, was still the key to everything, they thought. They revisited the cabin, once more inspecting the inside, hoping to find something, anything, that could provide clarity. But the cabin was empty. There were no signs of Jimmy. The walls, the furniture, all seemed to be preserved in time, as though no one had touched them for years. But despite the stillness of the place, they couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. As they moved along the edge of the water, something unusual caught their attention. A faint imprint in the soft mud near the shoreline. It wasn't much, just the outline of a shoe, barely distinguishable from the surrounding terrain. But it was enough to make their hearts skip a beat. Could this be a sign that someone, perhaps Jimmy, had been there recently? They took a closer look, but the footprint was too vague to confirm. There were no other tracks nearby, no signs of struggle, no other evidence that might suggest anyone had been there recently. But it was a reminder, another piece of the puzzle that might someday fit. With the hours dragging on, the group began to lose hope. It seemed like the lake, like so many other parts of the case, was just another dead end. The photograph, the mysterious figure, and now this faint imprint. None of it brought them any closer to answers. The frustration began to mount, as did the weight of the unsolved mystery. But just as they were about to give up for the day, one of the volunteers noticed something by the water's edge, a small, weathered journal half submerged in the mud. It had clearly been there for some time, but it was still intact. They pulled it out carefully, wiping off the dirt, and began to flip through its pages. It was a journal that Jimmy had kept during his earlier visits to the cabin, filled with musings about his life and his feelings. The entries were mostly benign, filled with observations about the natural world around him, his frustrations with work, and his hopes for the future. But there was one entry that stood out, one that made their hearts race. In the journal, Jimmy had written about a stranger who had been visiting the lake, someone he had encountered in the woods on one of his last trips there. He didn't name the person, but his words were clear. I feel watched. Like someone's always just behind me, waiting. I'm starting to wonder if I'm the one being followed. Could this be the same person in the photograph? The figure who had been standing outside the cabin, watching? The journal entry felt like it might be the missing piece of the puzzle, the link that connected all of these strange occurrences. The mystery was far from solved, but for the first time in weeks, they had something concrete. Jimmy had sensed something was wrong, and he had written it down, almost as if he knew his own disappearance was inevitable. The group left the lake with the journal in hand, a small, but significant victory. They didn't know where it would lead, but they couldn't ignore the chilling possibility that this stranger, whoever they were, might have played a part in what had happened to Jimmy. The case was far from over, but the journal gave them hope that they were one step closer to unraveling the truth. With the journal now in their hands, the investigation seemed to gain new momentum. The words Jimmy had written about feeling watched, about a shadow following him, created a strange mix of dread and determination. The idea that someone, possibly even the person in the photograph, had been stalking Jimmy was unsettling. But it was the first real lead they had that pointed to an unknown figure, someone who might have been involved, even if they weren't physically seen during the initial search. The journal had a subtle, almost poetic quality to it. Jimmy had been a thoughtful young man, not given to flights of fancy, but his words about feeling watched gave an eerie sense of foresight. He had written that the sensation of being followed had started off small, just the occasional rustle in the bushes, the fleeting shadow he couldn't quite place. But as time passed, he became more convinced that someone was indeed tracking his every move. The question now was, who was this stranger? And why hadn't anyone mentioned seeing someone like that before? Had they all just missed something crucial? In the coming days, the investigators interviewed anyone who had been near the lake, hoping someone might have seen or heard something that could lead them to this mysterious figure. But, just as before, no one could recall anything unusual. People in the town were either too caught up in their own lives or simply couldn't remember. It was like the stranger had been part of the landscape, invisible, slipping through the cracks. It was time to visit Corbin's Hollow again. Though they hadn't uncovered much on their last visit, the theory that Carl Weaver, the man from the mysterious house, might have known more became more plausible. After all, he was the only person who had been directly linked to Jimmy before the disappearance. It was hard to dismiss him entirely, especially with the strange way he had acted when Jimmy's friends came to ask about him. So they set out once more, back to the town that seemed so ordinary but was now shrouded in suspicion. This time, though, they decided to approach it more methodically. They had a list of questions prepared, and Carl Weaver was at the top of the list. They didn't have solid proof yet that he was involved, but his connection to Jimmy could no longer be ignored. When they arrived at his house, they found it much like it had been before. Quiet, still almost too quiet. The door was ajar, and they hesitated before knocking. After the previous encounter, they knew that Carl might not be forthcoming, but they had no choice but to try again. This time, Carl answered the door much more quickly. His tired eyes met theirs, but he didn't show any sign of surprise. It was as though he knew they were coming. "Can we speak to you for a moment?" one of the volunteers asked, holding up the journal as if to offer some proof of their seriousness. Carl's eyes flickered to the journal before he stepped aside and motioned for them to come in. There was no invitation, no warmth, just a gesture of someone who didn't want to turn them away, but wasn't eager to entertain them either. Once inside, the air felt thicker, charged with an unspoken tension. Carl sat down on a worn-out chair, his gaze steady but guarded. Jimmy's friends didn't waste time with pleasantries. They got right to the point. "We found this," they said, showing him the journal. Jimmy wrote about someone following him, someone he couldn't shake. "Do you know anything about that?" Carl's expression didn't change, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, a tightening of his shoulders, as if he had been expecting this moment. "I haven't seen Jimmy in years," he replied, his voice low. "I don't know what he was writing about, but if he felt like someone was following him, it wasn't me." But even as he spoke, there was something in the way he avoided their gaze. His words didn't match his body language. It wasn't enough to accuse him of anything outright, but it was certainly enough to keep him on their radar. And just as they were about to ask more, something unexpected happened. Carl leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "There's something you should know," he said, his tone suddenly urgent. "There's a reason I came back to Corbin's Hollow. It wasn't just because of the town. I had unfinished business. I had to make sure something stayed buried." His words hung in the air, thick with implication. What unfinished business? What had he meant by making sure something stayed buried? Was it possible that Carl knew more than he was letting on? Was he involved in Jimmy's disappearance? Or was he simply trying to protect his own secrets? The tension in the room seemed to rise, and it felt like they were on the brink of something significant. A revelation, a clue, or maybe the missing piece to the puzzle that had been haunting them for so long. Carl's next words could change everything. Carl's next words came slowly, as if he was weighing them carefully before speaking. "I know you're looking for Jimmy, but you won't find him by asking me," he said, his voice lower than before, almost a whisper. "Not unless you understand why he disappeared in the first place." The room felt colder, and the air seemed to thicken. Everyone in the room leaned in, eager for more, yet cautious about what was coming next. What could Carl possibly mean? Had Jimmy's disappearance been something planned, something deeper than just a young man going missing without reason? The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, waiting to be dissected. Carl sat back in his chair, the lines on his face more pronounced now, as though the weight of his past was catching up with him. His eyes flickered toward the window, and for a moment, he seemed lost in thought, as if contemplating whether to continue. The silence stretched on for a few moments before he spoke again, his voice now a little steadier. "You're looking for a person," Carl continued, "but sometimes people disappear for reasons that are far more complicated than just a missing persons case. Sometimes they want to disappear." The group exchanged uneasy glances. What did he mean? Was he suggesting Jimmy had just left on his own accord? That he had orchestrated his own vanishing? But that seemed impossible. Jimmy wasn't the type to disappear without telling anyone. He had a family that loved him, friends who cared for him. Why would he leave them behind? Carl let out a sigh, his fingers drumming nervously on the armrest of his chair. "There's a lot you don't know," he said quietly. "About me, about Jimmy, about the things we did together back in the day." Now, they were all sitting on the edge of their seats, listening intently. What did Carl mean by this? What could he possibly know that would explain Jimmy's disappearance? Carl hesitated again, glancing at the door before continuing. "Jimmy and I, we were part of something. Something you wouldn't understand. Something you shouldn't know about." His words were cryptic, and yet they held a truth in them. A truth that felt both horrifying and fascinating at the same time. The connection between Carl and Jimmy, it seemed, ran deeper than anyone could have imagined. They weren't just casual acquaintances, not just old school friends. There was something more, something far more secretive and dangerous. The volunteers exchanged looks. Was Carl saying that Jimmy had gotten caught up in something sinister? Had he become involved with people or activities that he couldn't get out of? What could be so dangerous that it had caused him to disappear without a trace? Carl's expression softened slightly, though his eyes still seemed haunted. "You don't understand," he muttered, as though speaking to himself. "You're looking in all the wrong places. The answers aren't where you think." The tension in the room grew thick, and for the first time, Carl seemed like he was on the verge of revealing something important, something that could change everything. Then, suddenly, the door creaked, and the sound of someone outside caused Carl to freeze. His eyes darted toward the door, and he immediately stood up, as if to make sure no one else heard what he had just started to reveal. The volunteers remained seated, frozen in place, waiting for Carl's next move. Would he continue? Would he share what he knew about Jimmy? Or was he pulling away again, retreating into the shadows of his past? Carl turned back to face them, his face etched with a mix of fear and frustration. "I'll tell you everything," he said quietly, "but not here. Not now. The group felt the weight of his words, and for a moment, no one said anything. The atmosphere had shifted. This was no longer just a case of a missing person. It was something more, a tangled web of secrets, lies, and unfinished business. And with that, Carl opened the door slightly, peering out into the darkened street. "Meet me tomorrow night," he said. "I'll tell you everything you need to know. But you have to promise me one thing. Don't tell anyone else." With that, Carl closed the door, leaving the group standing in stunned silence. What had they just heard? What could Carl possibly have to tell them that was so important, so dangerous, that it couldn't be shared right then? They didn't know, but one thing was certain. The next night, they would be back, and this time, they would get the answers they had been desperately searching for. The night felt heavier than it should have as the group gathered once more, the events of the past few days weighing on their minds. It was hard to shake off the eerie tension that lingered after Carl's cryptic words. "Don't tell anyone else." That had stuck with them, echoing in their minds as they made their way back to Corbin's Hollow. They drove in silence, the hum of the tires on the road the only sound that accompanied them. Each person was lost in thought, wondering what Carl was hiding, what he meant by unfinished business, and what exactly did he know about Jimmy's disappearance. The drive seemed to stretch on forever, the anticipation building with every mile. When they finally arrived at the outskirts of Corbin's Hollow, they parked in the same spot they had before, the quiet town now bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, casting long shadows across the streets. They approached Carl's house once again, but this time, something felt different. There was no turning back now. This was the moment where the pieces might finally start to come together. Carl's house was just as quiet as before, but this time, there was a sense of urgency in the air. He was expecting them, but the question was, what had he uncovered, and why had he been so secretive? They knocked on the door, and Carl appeared almost immediately, this time with a sense of unease in his eyes. He didn't invite them in right away, instead stepping out onto the porch, closing the door behind him as if to shield whatever was inside from prying eyes. "All right," Carl said, his voice low, almost nervous. "I told you I'd explain. But before we get into it, you need to understand something. This isn't something anyone can just talk about. It's not something anyone would want to be a part of." He paused, looking around as if to make sure no one was listening. But Jimmy, he got involved in something dangerous. And the more I tried to get him out of it, the more he seemed to fall deeper. Now they were all on edge. Was this it? Was this the breakthrough they had been waiting for? Carl took a deep breath before continuing. It was a group, an underground network of sorts. They operated in the shadows, dealing in things you wouldn't want to know about. Jimmy, he thought he could be part of it, that he could keep things under control. But he was wrong. The words hung in the air, each one carrying more weight than the last. A dangerous underground network? What could this possibly mean for Jimmy? Was he part of some criminal organization? Had he been dragged into something he couldn't escape from? The group exchanged worried glances. This wasn't the answer they had been hoping for, but it was the first real explanation they had gotten. And yet, it raised even more questions. What kind of group was Carl talking about? What exactly had Jimmy gotten mixed up in? Carl shifted uneasily on his feet. "I didn't want to tell you this, but the truth is, Jimmy's disappearance wasn't just about him running away. He didn't disappear on his own terms. Someone took him. Someone from that group." The room fell silent as the implications of Carl's words sank in. Jimmy hadn't just vanished into thin air. Someone had taken him, had forced him into whatever dangerous situation he had gotten involved in. "But why didn't you come forward sooner?" one of Jimmy's friends asked, his voice trembling with frustration. "Why keep all this hidden?" Carl ran a hand through his hair, his eyes clouded with regret. "I was trying to protect you all. I thought if I stayed quiet, I could stop anyone else from getting involved." I knew if I said anything, it would only make things worse for Jimmy. But now I realize I made a mistake. His voice faltered as he looked down at his feet, his hands trembling. I should have told you sooner. I just didn't want to drag anyone else into this. The group stood still, trying to process what Carl had just shared. The realization that Jimmy's disappearance had been tied to something far darker, far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined, left them speechless. But even as they stood there, they knew they had to keep going. There was no turning back now. Carl looked at them with a weary, pleading expression. If you want to find him, you need to go to where it all started. The place where Jimmy first got involved with them. It's a warehouse on the edge of town. If you don't find answers there, you won't find them anywhere. Without another word, Carl turned and walked back into his house, leaving the group standing on the porch, processing everything they had just learned. The air felt colder now, heavier as they made their way back to the car. The search wasn't over. In fact, it felt like it was only just beginning, in the warehouse Carl had mentioned. This was where the truth would either be confirmed or shattered. They had one final stop to make before the mystery could finally be solved. The drive to the warehouse on the outskirts of Corbin's Hollow felt like an eternity. It was past midnight, and the roads were empty, bathed only in the faint glow of street lamps that seemed too distant to offer much comfort. The air in the car was thick with tension, everyone lost in their own thoughts. The discovery that Jimmy's disappearance had been linked to a dangerous underground group was unsettling, but the fact that Carl knew where this all began, that was something they couldn't ignore. The closer they got to the warehouse, the quieter the car became. There was an unspoken agreement among the group that tonight would be the night they found the answers. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie light over the vast, empty landscape around them. The warehouse loomed ahead, standing alone against the vastness of the fields, its silhouette dark and imposing against the night sky. As they pulled up to the entrance, the group could see that the warehouse was abandoned, or at least it appeared that way. The windows were dark, the large metal doors locked tight. It seemed almost too quiet, too easy, the kind of place that felt abandoned by time, yet held a strange energy like it had been waiting for someone to come. The car came to a stop just outside the gates, and the volunteers piled out one by one, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the still night. They moved cautiously, their nerves palpable in the cool night air. Everyone had their eyes on the building, but no one said anything. It was as if speaking would break the fragile illusion that they were still in control of the situation. "Let's stay close," one of them whispered, trying to mask the nervous tremor in their voice. "We don't know what's in there." They circled around the side of the warehouse, searching for any sign of an entry point. The steel walls were solid, with no obvious signs of movement or life. It seemed like the place had been forgotten by everyone except the people who had once used it. And perhaps, now, the people who were looking for Jimmy. Finally, they found it. A side door, hidden in the shadows of the building, slightly ajar. Someone must have left it that way. Or maybe it had been forced open at some point. Either way, it was their only chance. They gathered around the door, each one of them hesitant but determined. One of the volunteers, a tall man with a steady hand, took the lead. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking softly in the quiet night. The smell of dust and mildew hit them immediately as they stepped inside, the dim light from the doorway casting long, distorted shadows across the vast, empty space. Inside, the warehouse was cavernous. Shelves lined the walls, stacked high with old crates, some broken open, their contents spilling out haphazardly. The floor was littered with debris, and the only sound was the soft echo of their footsteps as they moved deeper into the building. It felt abandoned, like no one had been there in years. But something wasn't right. The deeper they went, the more the unease settled in. They could feel eyes on them, even if there was no one there. The silence seemed too heavy, as if the building was holding its breath, waiting for them to uncover its secrets. The group split up, each one searching for any clue that might connect the warehouse to Jimmy's disappearance. As one volunteer moved toward the back of the building, they stumbled upon something unexpected, an old file cabinet tucked away in a dark corner, almost hidden from view. They approached it cautiously, opening the drawers one by one. Inside, they found stacks of papers, documents of some sort. There were names, dates, addresses, nothing that immediately made sense. But as they sifted through the files, something caught their eye. A name. Jimmy's name. The papers were old, faded, and hard to read, but it was unmistakable. Jimmy's name was listed on a document, and beneath it was a series of cryptic numbers and symbols. It was a record, some kind of log, but it didn't explain why his name was there or what it had to do with the people who had been operating in this place. At that moment, the group froze. They realized they weren't alone. A door at the far end of the warehouse creaked open, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the room. The volunteers exchanged nervous glances, their hearts racing in their chests. Who else was here? And what did they know about Jimmy's disappearance? Before they could react, a figure stepped out from the shadows. A tall man, wearing a dark jacket, his face partially obscured by a hood. He stopped in the middle of the warehouse, his eyes scanning the group, assessing them with a cold, calculating gaze. Looking for something? He asked, his voice low and calm, almost as if he had been expecting them. The tension in the room thickened. The group was caught, unsure of who this man was or what his intentions were. But one thing was certain, this was no ordinary person. He was connected to whatever had happened to Jimmy, and they had just found the first real lead to uncovering the truth. The man's voice seemed to hang in the air, and for a moment, time itself seemed to slow. The group remained frozen, the files they had just uncovered forgotten for the moment. All eyes were on the man in the shadows, who still hadn't moved. There was a coldness in the way he regarded them, as though he knew exactly who they were and why they had come. His hood was still low, casting his features in darkness, but his posture was assured, confident. This wasn't just some random figure. He was someone who belonged here, someone who had power, even in a place this forgotten. One of the volunteers, the one who had spoken earlier, finally found his voice, though it came out shaky. "Who are you?" he asked, stepping forward. "What do you know about Jimmy?" The man let out a soft, almost amused chuckle. "Jimmy," he repeated the name, drawing it out. "You've been looking for him, haven't you? Well, you found me. But I think you already know that, don't you?" His words sent a chill through the group. It was as if he knew exactly what they had been uncovering, as if he had been watching them all along. The realization hit them. They weren't just dealing with someone who had information. They were dealing with someone who had been orchestrating this entire situation from behind the scenes. The figure stepped forward, his movements smooth and deliberate. "It's not a surprise that you've come here," he continued, his voice laced with a calm menace. "Jimmy wasn't the first to get caught up in things he couldn't control, and he won't be the last." The group took a cautious step back, the sense of danger growing palpable with every word he spoke. This wasn't just about Jimmy anymore. It was about something much bigger, and they were tangled in it, whether they liked it or not. "Who are you?" Another volunteer repeated, their voice firmer now, but their eyes still filled with fear. "What's going on here?" The man's lips curled into something resembling a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I told you," he said. "I know what you're looking for, but I don't think you'll like what you find." He paused for a moment, allowing the tension to build even further. Then, with a deliberate slowness, he raised his hands and pulled down the hood, revealing his face. The sight of him took the group by surprise. He wasn't someone they had expected. He was an older man, maybe in his late 40s, but his expression was hard, his eyes sharp with a cold intelligence. His face was lean, his features sharp and angular, as though carved by the harshest of conditions. He had the kind of face you'd expect from someone who had spent years in the shadows, someone who was used to operating without being seen. "I'm not your enemy," he said, though there was no comfort in his voice. "But I'm not your friend either." The group was silent, unsure of how to react. This man, whoever he was playing a game with them, and it was a game they weren't yet equipped to understand. "I've been watching Jimmy for a long time," he continued. "He came to us with hope, thinking he could make things right. But in the end, he was just another pawn in a much larger scheme. And now, you're here, poking around, asking questions. But you don't understand the consequences of what you're doing. You think you're saving Jimmy, but all you're doing is digging a grave for yourself." His words were chilling, and they made the group pause. What had Jimmy gotten involved in? And what had this man meant by pawn? The older man stepped closer, his footsteps echoing softly in the cavernous space. "You want to know what happened to Jimmy? Fine, but you're going to have to understand what you're really up against first." He looked directly at the group, his gaze never wavering. "The network Jimmy got involved in, it's not what you think. It's not just about money or power or influence. It's about control. Control over information, over people. And once you get involved, there's no way out." The group remained still, too stunned by the revelation to speak. They had no idea what they were really dealing with. The stakes were higher than they ever imagined. One of the volunteers stepped forward, their voice shaking but determined. "Then tell us what happened to Jimmy, and what this is all about." The man nodded, his expression unreadable. "It's time you knew the truth. But once you hear it, there's no turning back. You're already too far in." He paused, as if to gauge their resolve, and then finally, with a heavy sigh, he began to speak, telling them of the secret network that had ensnared Jimmy. A network that wasn't just hidden in the shadows of Corbin's Hollow, but spread across cities, countries, even continents. A network of people pulling strings, controlling lives, manipulating events from behind closed doors. And Jimmy had been caught in its web, unknowingly becoming part of something far bigger than himself. But as the man spoke, there was one thing that stood out above all else. Jimmy had never been meant to be a permanent part of their operations. His disappearance was no accident. It had been planned. Jimmy had known too much, and now it seemed so did they. The gravity of the man's words settled on the group like a heavy blanket. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was anything but comforting. The world Jimmy had gotten involved in wasn't some harmless secret club. It was a vast, insidious network that thrived on manipulation and control, and had a reach far beyond what anyone had imagined. The man's eyes gleamed coldly as he spoke, his words precise and calculated, like a chess player revealing the next moves in a game that had already been set in motion. Jimmy wasn't just a random victim. He was chosen, he said, his voice carrying the weight of an unsettling truth. He had something they wanted, something that was going to change the game for them. The group exchanged nervous glances, each of them trying to wrap their minds around the magnitude of the situation. Something they hadn't even considered, the idea that Jimmy's disappearance was more than just a random crime, but part of a much larger scheme. But what had he known? What could Jimmy have possibly stumbled upon that made him such a threat? The man continued, watching them closely. You see, Jimmy didn't know it at the time, but he was on the brink of uncovering something important. He was getting too close to the truth, and in this world, the truth is a dangerous thing. The room grew colder as the implications of the man's words sank in. Every person in the group was starting to feel the weight of their involvement. They had thought they were just trying to find their missing friend, but now they were in the midst of something much darker. They weren't just solving a crime. They were uncovering a web of corruption and conspiracy that spanned far beyond the confines of Corbin's Hollow. "What do you mean?" one of the volunteers asked, their voice quivering. "What did he find out?" The man's lips curled into a thin smile, as though he found some sort of amusement in their confusion. "Let me put it this way. Jimmy didn't just disappear into thin air. Someone made sure of that. And they did it because he knew too much about something they couldn't allow to be exposed." He paused, allowing the group to process what he was saying. They were all hanging on to his every word now, desperate for answers, even if those answers were unsettling. "You don't understand the scope of it," he continued. "The people behind this network, they control information. They can make people disappear. They can ruin lives without anyone even knowing. And Jimmy had accidentally stumbled onto something they didn't want out in the open." The air in the warehouse seemed to grow even colder, as if the building itself was absorbing the weight of the secret the man was revealing. Everyone stood frozen, trying to process the enormity of what they were hearing. How had Jimmy gotten so deeply involved? How had he become a part of something so vast and so dangerous? The man seemed to sense their growing fear and smiled again. But this time, it was a smile full of dark knowledge. "I won't lie to you," he said. "Jimmy's not coming back. Not because we don't know where he is, but because the people who took him don't leave loose ends. And they don't leave survivors." His words hung in the air, the finality of them sinking into the group's hearts. There was no happy ending here. There was no simple resolution. Jimmy had become a casualty of a much larger game, a game that they now found themselves unwittingly a part of. One of the volunteers, their voice almost breaking, spoke up. "So what do we do now? Is there any way to stop this? To save him?" The man's expression darkened, and for a moment, he looked like he was weighing something, deciding whether or not to share the next piece of information. When he finally spoke, it was with a resigned sigh. "You can't stop it," he said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "You can't stop them. No one can. Not unless you're willing to sacrifice everything. Your safety, your lives. And even then, you'd be fighting a battle you can't win." The hopelessness in his voice was enough to make the group's hearts drop. This wasn't a case they could solve with a few more days of searching or a lucky break. They were out of their depth, and the man standing before them had just made that abundantly clear. "But there's still something you can do," the man added after a long silence, almost as if he was giving them a final chance to choose. "You can walk away. You can forget about Jimmy, forget about this whole thing. Let it go and live your lives. But if you continue on this path, if you keep pushing, well, you'll get more than you bargained for. And it won't just be Jimmy's fate you'll be trying to change." He let the words linger, giving the group a chance to absorb them. His warning wasn't just a threat. It was a warning about the inevitable consequences of continuing down this dark road. They stood in silence for a long time, the weight of the decision hanging over them. What was the right thing to do? Walk away and pretend none of this had ever happened? Or risk everything to uncover the truth? But even as they stood there, each of them knew deep down that walking away wasn't an option. They had come too far, discovered too much, and now there was no turning back. Whatever it took, they would find out what had happened to Jimmy, even if it meant plunging deeper into the darkness than they ever expected. The room was thick with tension as the man's words lingered in the air. There was no turning back now. They had come this far, and the weight of the choice before them felt almost unbearable. Could they walk away and live with the fact that they had left Jimmy to whatever fate had befallen him? Could they continue, knowing the danger that loomed over them? But in the silence, a single voice broke through the stillness, firm and resolute. It was one of Jimmy's closest friends, a person who had been with him through thick and thin, and who had never once questioned their bond. "We're not walking away," they said quietly, but with undeniable conviction. We've come this far for Jimmy, and we're not going to stop now. We're not going to let fear decide for us." The words hung in the air, a defiant challenge to the fear that had crept into each of their hearts. The group exchanged glances, each of them realizing that they had already crossed a line. There was no going back now. They had to keep going. The man standing in front of them watched, almost as if he were assessing their resolve. His expression was unreadable, and for a moment, the tension felt like it might snap. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice cold and matter-of-fact. "But if you want to continue, you'll need to be prepared for what comes next. There's no turning back from this path. The network is everywhere, and they won't hesitate to silence anyone who stands in their way. We're ready." Another volunteer spoke up, their voice stronger now. "We've come too far to stop now." The man nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the group as if to ensure that they were fully aware of the dangers ahead. "Fine," he said. "Then I'll help you. But be warned, whatever happens next, you're on your own. Once you take the next step, there's no going back." He paused, his gaze hardening. "Follow me." The group had no choice but to obey. There was something unsettlingly calm about the way he moved, as if he had already made peace with the consequences of what was about to unfold. He led them through the warehouse, past rows of rusted machinery and stacks of crates, to a small door hidden in the back. The door was old, the wood creaking as it opened to reveal a staircase that led down into darkness. "This way," the man said, his voice low as he descended the stairs. They followed him, their footsteps echoing in the silent space. The air grew cooler, and the atmosphere became even more oppressive. The further down they went, the more it felt as though they were descending into some kind of underworld, a place where no light had ever reached. The staircase opened into a small, dimly lit room, its walls lined with old files and documents. There was a table in the center, covered with papers, maps, and photographs. It was clear that this was where the network operated from, hidden away from the world above. The man turned to face them, his eyes dark and serious. "This is where it all begins," he said quietly. "The information you're looking for is here. But once you've seen it, you'll understand why they went to such lengths to keep it hidden." The group exchanged uneasy glances, but none of them hesitated. They had come this far, and they were committed now. He gestured toward the table. "These are the records. They detail everything, the people involved, the operations, the connections. But be warned, once you look at these, you'll know too much. And there's no way to unsee what you'll learn." With those words, the man stepped back, leaving them to approach the table. The papers were old, yellowed with age, but the names, dates, and details written on them were clear. They started sifting through the files, their hands shaking as they tried to make sense of it all. There were names they recognized, names of people who had been part of Jimmy's life, people who had slipped through the cracks unnoticed. There were documents about smuggling rings, corrupt officials, and businesses with ties to powerful people. There were maps of cities, marked with locations, dates, and times. Information about secret meetings and deals that had been made in the shadows. And then they found it. A file marked Project Nightfall. It detailed the operation that had ensnared Jimmy, the network he had unknowingly become a part of, and the dangerous path he had walked down. It was a plan that involved powerful figures, people with the resources and influence to make anyone disappear without a trace. The realization hit them all at once. Jimmy had known too much, and that knowledge had made him a target. The network had seen him as a threat and had taken action to silence him. But what now? They had the answers, but what could they do with them? The truth was now laid bare before them, and they had to decide what to do with it. The man who had led them here turned to face them again. "You have the truth now," he said, his tone resigned. "What you do with it is up to you. But be careful. The moment you take this information to anyone outside of this room, the network will know. and they won't stop until they've eliminated the threat. The group stood in stunned silence, the weight of what they had uncovered sinking in. They had the answers they had been searching for. But now, they were faced with a choice: expose the network and risk their lives, or stay quiet and live with the knowledge that Jimmy's fate had already been sealed. The decision was theirs. The decision hung in the air like a dark cloud, each of them feeling the immense pressure of what they now knew. The room, once filled with the hum of their curiosity, had grown heavy with the burden of knowledge. The papers on the table lay before them, offering a glimpse into a world that was darker, more dangerous than any of them had imagined. It was the kind of world that didn't just break laws, it shattered lives and erased the very people who dared to get in the way. The man who had led them here seemed to sense their hesitation. He stood back, allowing them the space to come to terms with the truth, yet his presence loomed over them like a shadow. He had given them everything they needed to take down the network, but he had also shown them how dangerous it would be to act on that knowledge. "Make no mistake," he said softly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "You can expose them, but you'll have to fight with everything you have. And you won't be able to trust anyone, not even the authorities. They have their own ties to this world." A chill ran through the group. The idea of exposing the network seemed impossible now. They weren't just dealing with some rogue group of criminals. They were up against a vast, sprawling operation with ties to the highest levels of power and influence. The people involved were untouchable, and the stakes had escalated to a point where there was no safe option left. Exposing them wasn't just about justice. It was about survival. One of the volunteers, the one who had first spoken with Carl, stepped forward, her voice steady but laced with a tremor of fear. "We can't just walk away from this. Jimmy wouldn't have. We can't let these people continue what they're doing." Her words, though fraught with emotion, carried the weight of conviction. It wasn't just about solving a missing persons case anymore. It was about stopping something far more insidious, a network that had been operating in the shadows, ruining lives and leaving destruction in its wake. The others nodded, each one silently agreeing. They had come too far to turn back now. They couldn't just bury the truth and live with the knowledge that they had the power to stop it, but chose to look away. The man at the table watched them, his expression unreadable. "You're sure about this?" he asked, though it felt more like a statement than a question. "Once you take action, there's no turning back. You'll be marked as enemies, and they won't stop until you're all gone." There was a pause, and then, without a word, the group began to gather the files. Each document, each name on those papers, felt like a weapon now, a weapon that they could use to expose the network, to put an end to the suffering it had caused. The decision was made. "We'll do it," said the volunteer who had first spoken up. Her voice was stronger now, firmer than before. "We'll expose them, no matter the cost." The man's lips curled into a thin smile, though it lacked any trace of warmth. "Then be prepared for war. This won't be easy, and it won't be pretty, but it's the only way." The group looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. There was no turning back now. They had chosen the path they would walk, dangerous, uncertain, and fraught with peril. But they couldn't let fear dictate their actions anymore. They couldn't let the darkness win. As they made their way back to the car, the weight of the decision pressed down on their shoulders. But there was something else too, something stirring deep inside them. A sense of purpose, a sense that they were doing the right thing, even if it meant risking everything they had. They couldn't leave Jimmy's fate unresolved, and they couldn't let the network continue to destroy lives in the shadows. The journey ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. They would have to fight with everything they had, against the people who controlled the truth, against the system that had been corrupted, and against the fear that sought to paralyze them. But they were ready. They had no choice. They were no longer just searching for answers. They were going to bring the truth to light, no matter the cost. The night felt different as they drove away from the warehouse. The weight of their decision was heavy, but it was also liberating. They knew what they had to do, and they knew they couldn't do it alone. They would need each other more than ever before. And as they drove into the night, the horizon ahead of them seemed just a little bit brighter, despite the darkness they knew lay ahead. The car hummed steadily on the road, the headlights cutting through the night, illuminating only what lay directly ahead. It was a stark contrast to the uncertainty that clouded the group's minds. They had made their decision. They were going to expose the network, but now that the weight of the choice had settled, they found themselves facing the magnitude of what lay ahead. There was no longer a clear path forward. The files they had gathered, the network's shadowy connections, they were just pieces of a puzzle too vast to solve easily. They weren't just up against criminals anymore. They were up against a system that had been in place for years, one with power, resources, and influence that they couldn't even begin to comprehend. The silence in the car was thick, each person lost in their own thoughts. What would they do next? Where would they even start? The files were invaluable, but exposing the network would require more than just information. It would take careful planning, collaboration, and above all, the courage to face the people behind the operation. How do we even begin? One of the volunteers finally asked, breaking the silence. How do we take this on? We're just normal people. They'll destroy us if we try. The words hung in the air, heavy with doubt. It wasn't just the fear of failure. It was the fear of what might happen to them if they didn't succeed. They were already marked now, and the network had eyes everywhere. There was no room for mistakes. But another voice, one filled with more certainty, spoke up. We start small, it said. We use the information we've gathered to build connections. We find allies, people who are already fighting the same fight. We can't do this alone, but we don't have to. The group turned toward the voice, their eyes filled with a mix of uncertainty and hope. It was true what the voice said. They couldn't fight this battle alone. They would need to rely on others who were willing to stand up to the network, to risk everything just as they had. We go to the press first, another volunteer suggested. If we can get the story out in the open, if we can expose the network's operations, it'll be harder for them to cover it up. Public pressure could force the authorities to act. It was a risky move, but the more they thought about it, the more it seemed like their best option. If they could get the press on their side, they could turn the tide. The network relied on secrecy, on staying hidden in the shadows. But if the world knew what they were doing, if the media could shed light on their dark dealings, maybe they could disrupt the operation long enough to expose the truth. But there was still the matter of their safety. The man who had led them to the warehouse had made it clear. If they exposed the network, they would be marked as enemies. They would become targets. The group's decision to press forward with their plan could cost them everything. We need protection, one of them murmured, the words barely audible over the hum of the car's engine. We need to be careful. If they come for us, we won't have anywhere to hide. The reality of what they were about to face hit them all at once. The stakes had never been higher, and every step from here on out would require them to move carefully, methodically. There was no room for error. They had to act quickly but cautiously, making sure not to alert the network too soon, while also gathering enough information to make their case irrefutable. We can't go to the police right now, another volunteer added. We don't know who's working with them. We can't trust anyone until we have everything we need. The press might be the only way to get it out there safely. The decision was made. They would go to the press first. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was the best they had. And once the story was out, once the world knew the truth, they could no longer be silenced. As the car sped down the road, the weight of their decision settled over them. There was no turning back. They were in this together, and they would face whatever came next with resolve. They were no longer just searching for Jimmy. They were fighting for justice, for the truth. And that fight would not be easy, but they were ready. The journey ahead would be long. They would face danger, uncertainty, and fear. But they had the truth on their side, and that was more powerful than anything the network could throw at them. As they neared their destination, the first stop on their path toward exposing the network, they looked at each other, knowing that the fight was just beginning. They were no longer just individuals. They were a team, united by their determination to bring the truth to light, no matter the cost. They didn't know what the future held, but they knew one thing for certain. They would never stop fighting. The city lights flickered in the distance as the car rolled into the heart of the bustling metropolis, its fast-paced energy a stark contrast to the weight they carried. It wasn't just the weight of their decision, but the weight of the lives they were about to change. They had chosen their path. They had committed to exposing the network, to putting everything on the line to find Jimmy and uncover the truth. The city, with its towering buildings and busy streets, felt alive in a way that seemed almost foreign after the quiet of Corbin's Hollow and the desolate warehouse. It was a new world now, and they were walking into it with the files in hand and a plan that had no guarantees. It was a world of risk, of danger, but also one where they could find the allies they so desperately needed. As they parked near their first meeting point, the office of a journalist who had been investigating the network for months, they exchanged looks that conveyed everything that words couldn't. This wasn't just a routine meeting. This was the beginning of something much bigger, something that would change their lives forever. Inside the office, the journalist was waiting for them. She was a seasoned reporter, known for her work exposing corruption. And though her reputation had made her a target for many, she was undeterred. The media could be a powerful ally, but it could also be a dangerous one. She understood the risks involved, and she knew the network they were up against all too well. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with concern as she eyed the files they handed over. "Once we go public, there's no turning back. The network will come after us with everything they've got." The weight of her words didn't escape them. It wasn't just about revealing a network of criminals anymore. It was about survival. They were about to make themselves targets, and the road they had chosen would be filled with obstacles, threats, and dangers they couldn't even predict. "We have no choice," one of the volunteers said, their voice resolute. "If we don't expose them, they'll keep doing this to people. Jimmy is just one of many. We have to stop them." The journalist nodded, her face hardening with determination. "Then we do this right. No mistakes. I'll get this into the right hands, get the media involved, get the story out there. But we need to move fast. The longer we wait, the more dangerous it gets." They spent the next few hours outlining their plan. It was meticulous, calculated. The journalist would work to get the story published, and they would continue to dig deeper, following any lead they could find, no matter how small. They would keep the pressure on, using the media to push the network into a corner. But as they finalized the plan, one of the volunteers spoke up, their voice filled with doubt. "What if we're not enough? What if the media doesn't pick up the story? What if they try to silence us before we even have a chance?" The room grew still as everyone absorbed the question. It was a possibility they had all considered but hadn't spoken aloud. The network they were up against was vast, and they had the power to crush anyone who stood in their way. But if they didn't stand up now, if they didn't fight back, then everything Jimmy had gone through would be in vain. "We have to try," another volunteer said, their voice filled with a quiet urgency. "Even if it's dangerous. Even if we don't know what's going to happen. We can't let them win." The journalist met their gaze, her eyes sharp with resolve. "We'll make it happen. But remember, this isn't just about exposing them. It's about staying alive long enough to do it." As they left the office, they felt the full weight of their decision settle over them. This wasn't just about revealing secrets. It was about battling a powerful enemy, one that had the means to destroy their lives. But even as the fear loomed over them, they knew they had no choice. They had to do this for Jimmy, for the people whose lives had been destroyed by the network, for the truth that had to be exposed. The path ahead was unclear, fraught with danger and uncertainty. But they were no longer the same people who had first stepped into the mystery of Jimmy's disappearance. They had become something else: fighters, seekers of truth, and defenders of justice. And with each step they took, they knew that they were one step closer to taking down the darkness that had lingered over so many lives. The fight had just begun, and no matter the cost, they would see it through to the end. The days that followed felt like a whirlwind. The clock was ticking, and every decision, every move, felt fraught with the weight of what was at stake. The journalist had worked quickly, leveraging her contacts in the media to spread the story. It was only a matter of time before the world would know the truth about the network, about Jimmy, and the shadowy operations that had been pulling the strings in the background for so long. But as the story began to take shape, the group couldn't help but feel the creeping weight of danger lurking behind every corner. They had no way of knowing if the media's involvement would be enough to expose the network, or if it would simply provoke them further. Would the story catch fire, or would it be buried before it could ever make a real impact? The tension in the air was thick, and every phone call, every conversation, felt like a potential threat. They couldn't be sure who was on their side and who was already working for the network. For all they knew, the people they were trying to protect could be the very ones who were feeding the enemy information. I keep thinking about Carl. One of the volunteers said one evening as they sat together planning their next move. If he knew all this, if he was part of it, how do we know we can trust anyone? Maybe he was leading us right into their hands all along. The suspicion in the air was palpable, but the group knew that now wasn't the time to doubt each other. They had a mission, and it was far from over. Trust would come later if they survived long enough to see it through. "I know it's hard," another volunteer said, "but we can't let fear control us. We have the truth now. We just have to make sure it gets out there and that people take it seriously." It was easier said than done, of course. The world they were now fighting to expose wasn't a simple one. It wasn't just a group of criminals in a back room. It was a network with ties that reached into powerful circles. And with power came control. As the media coverage started to gain traction, the group kept their eyes on the news, watching for any sign of retaliation. The network, they knew, would not take kindly to their story being brought into the light. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about control. They had to silence the truth before it spread too far. And then one night it happened. The group was huddled in their temporary safe house when they heard the sound of tires screeching to a halt outside. There was a moment of complete silence, and then the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching the door. Without thinking, they all sprang into action, their hearts racing. Someone found them. They had been tracked. There was no way to escape. The door burst open with a loud bang, and the group froze. But it wasn't the network coming for them, as they had feared. Instead, it was the journalist. She had arrived, breathless with wide eyes. "They know," she gasped, looking around at the group. "They know we're coming for them. They're going to retaliate. They've already started to silence the ones who were working with us." The room grew quiet as the weight of her words sank in. The retaliation had begun. The network was already moving to destroy everything they had worked for. People they trusted were being silenced. Connections were being severed. And it was only going to get worse. But there was no turning back now. The truth was out. The fight for justice had been ignited, and the network wasn't about to go down quietly. "We have to act now," one of the volunteers said, determination in their eyes. "We have the public's attention. If we back down now, they'll win." The journalist nodded grimly. "I can't stop the backlash from coming. but I can help you expose more. We can flood the media with evidence. We need to be quick. If we wait too long, we might lose our chance." The group gathered their things, ready to push forward. The world was watching, but so were their enemies. The only way forward was to keep pushing, keep fighting, and not let fear stop them. They left the safe house in the dead of night, knowing they were walking into a storm. But they had no other choice. They couldn't let the network control the narrative any longer. They couldn't let them win. As they made their way toward the next step in their plan, they knew that there was no guarantee of success. They might never see the end of this fight. But one thing was certain. They had come too far to stop now. The truth would not be buried again. And whatever happened, they would make sure that Jimmy's story, the story of those who had been wronged, would be told. They had come this far, and they were not going to stop. The cold night air hit them as they stepped out into the streets, their hearts pounding in their chests. Every shadow seemed to hold danger. Every sound felt too loud. They couldn't afford to stop now. There was no time to waste. The network had started to retaliate, and they had to move fast to stay one step ahead. The truth was already out there, but the question was how much of it would survive the darkness that the network would try to cast over it. They piled into the car, their eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs that they were being followed. The tension was thick, but their resolve was stronger. Each of them had become a part of something bigger than just Jimmy's disappearance. This was now about a fight for truth, for justice, for exposing a hidden world that had been controlling too much for far too long. "We need to get to the press office," the journalist said, her voice steady despite the fear that lingered in her eyes. "If we're going to keep this going, we need more evidence out there. We need to make sure the world can't ignore us." But even as she spoke, they knew the risks. The closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. Every step forward felt like walking into a trap. But what choice did they have? If they turned back, the network would continue operating, continuing to destroy lives, continuing to control the people who had no choice but to live in the shadows. The city lights blurred as they drove through the streets, the hum of the tires on asphalt barely cutting through the heavy silence. As they neared the press office, the air grew thick with a sense of impending danger. They weren't just exposing a network anymore. They were declaring war on a powerful enemy. The weight of their decision bore down on them with every passing minute. When they reached the office, the journalist led them through a back entrance, where they were greeted by her trusted colleagues. They had been waiting, prepared to help, ready to take the next step. The plan was clear: flood the media with as much evidence as possible, get the story into the public's hands, and use the pressure to force the authorities to act. But even as they prepared to move forward, something fell off. The office was unusually quiet. The usual energy that came with breaking news was absent. "Where is everyone?" one of the volunteers asked, their voice strained. The journalist hesitated for a moment, her brow furrowing. They were supposed to be here, ready to get the story out. And that's when they noticed it. The door to the main office was ajar. Slowly, cautiously, they moved toward it. As they pushed it open, a sense of dread washed over them. The office was empty, but the atmosphere was heavy. Papers were scattered on the floor, the remnants of a hasty exit. There was no sign of the team that had been working with them. "No," the journalist whispered, her face pale. "They've been here. The network's already moving. We've been compromised." The gravity of the situation hit them like a freight train. The network had anticipated their every move. They had planned for this. The closer they got to exposing the truth, the more desperate the network became. And now they had struck first. "Get to the safe house," the journalist said, her voice trembling with urgency. "Now, we need to lay low until we figure out what's going on. If they've compromised this office, they'll be coming for all of us." Panic began to set in, but they didn't waste any time. They grabbed the remaining documents, the evidence they had worked so hard to uncover, and rushed toward the exit. But even as they moved through the back hallways, a sinking feeling gnawed at them. This wasn't just a fight for truth anymore. This was survival. Outside, the streets were just as dark as they had been when they arrived, but now the shadows seemed more menacing, as though something was lurking just out of sight. The group piled into the car, their eyes scanning every corner, every person who passed by. Were they being watched? Were they already too late? As they sped toward the safe house, the reality of their situation hit them. The network had a reach far beyond what they had imagined. They weren't just fighting a group of criminals. They were up against an enemy that could move silently, striking without warning, leaving no trace behind. The safe house, hidden in a quiet part of the city, felt like the only refuge they had left. But even as they pulled into the driveway, they knew it was only temporary. The network was too powerful, and their time was running out. The moment they exposed the full scope of the operation, they would become targets, and the network wouldn't stop until they were silenced. They had to act quickly, but they also had to be careful. One mistake, one misstep, and it could all come crashing down. The group gathered inside the safe house, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. They had the truth. They had the evidence. But the question was, could they get out in time? Could they stop the network from burying it all before the world could hear? The hours dragged on as they worked to prepare their next move, each of them acutely aware of how fragile their position was. Every decision they made, every action they took, would have consequences. They had no guarantees, no safety nets, but they had come too far to stop now. They had come this far because they believed in the truth. And no matter what happened, they would fight until the very end to make sure it was heard. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, each second stretching out like an eternity. The safe house, normally a place of refuge, felt more like a trap now. Every creak of the floorboards, every slight movement outside the windows heightened their sense of unease. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional murmur as they continued to prepare the next phase of their plan. The truth was out there, but the network was closing in on them. The clock was ticking, and they couldn't afford to waste any more time. They gathered around the small table, the room illuminated by a single overhead light. The files, photos, and maps were spread out in front of them. They had everything they needed: evidence, contacts, a story. But now, the real challenge was getting it out to the world before the network silenced them all. "The network won't let us make it easy," the journalist said, her voice calm but laced with tension. "They've already shut down half of my contacts, but we still have a chance. The press is starting to catch on, but we need to keep pushing. If we back down now, everything will be for nothing." The group nodded in agreement, their faces set with determination. They had come this far because they couldn't bear the thought of leaving Jimmy's fate unknown or letting the network continue unchecked. But now, more than ever, the danger was real. They couldn't stop now, not when they were so close. "We need to get this out to the right people," one of the volunteers said. "The media, the authorities, even the people in power who might not be directly involved but could help us take down this network. We need to expose them to everyone, not just the public." The plan was risky, but it was the best they had. The next few hours would be crucial. They couldn't afford any mistakes. Every phone call, every email, every interaction had to be handled with care. They would need to work in the shadows, moving quickly and silently, and trusting no one who wasn't already on their side. As they finalized their preparations, the journalist took out her phone and began making calls, reaching out to her last remaining contacts. Meanwhile, the volunteers reviewed the files again, looking for any last piece of information they could use to strengthen their case. They weren't just fighting to uncover a crime. They were fighting for their lives, for justice, and for the truth that Jimmy had been willing to risk everything to uncover. Suddenly, the phone rang. The sound was sharp in the quiet room, and everyone froze. For a moment, it felt like the world had stopped, and all their fears were realized. Was it the network? Had they found them? The journalist grabbed the phone, her face pale. She listened for a moment, her expression unreadable, before her shoulders slumped in exhaustion. "It's the press," she said softly. "They're on board. But it's not over. They'll need more proof, direct links, and we need to move fast. The network is already trying to stop the story from going public." She hung up the phone, her face a mixture of relief and dread. This was it. The press was willing to take the story, but they needed everything they had. The pressure was on, and they didn't have much time. "We've got one shot," the journalist said, looking around at the group. "If we can get this story out, if we can break through the noise, it'll force their hand. But if we don't, we're done." And so is Jimmy. The group stood in silence for a moment, each person feeling the weight of the situation. There was no turning back now. They had already made it too far. They had uncovered the truth, and now they had to push forward, no matter the cost. "Let's do it," one of the volunteers said, their voice resolute. The plan was set into motion quickly, each of them taking their assigned roles. The journalist worked with the press, feeding them as much information as she could without revealing everything, while the group continued to protect the files and ensure their security. They knew the risks. They knew they were being watched, but they were ready to face whatever came next. The next few hours passed in a blur. They sent the information out, reached out to everyone they could trust, and waited. It was a strange feeling, like holding your breath before the inevitable crash. They knew the network wouldn't give up easily, but this time they weren't backing down. And then it happened. The first story hit the press, and it was everything they had hoped for. It was a massive breakthrough. Details about the network, names, operations, and connections, everything was out in the open. The press was running with it, and the story was spreading fast. But the group didn't have time to celebrate. They knew the network would retaliate. It was only a matter of time before they came for them. "This is just the beginning," the journalist said, her voice steady despite the danger they all knew was coming. "We got their attention now. We need to make sure we're ready for what comes next." As they sat in the safe house, watching the news unfold on TV, they knew they had made the right choice. They had taken a stand, they had exposed the truth, and they had set the wheels of justice in motion. But the battle wasn't over. The network wouldn't just fade away. They were playing a dangerous game, and every step forward would come with a cost. But as long as they had each other, as long as they had the truth on their side, they were ready for whatever came next. The hours following the release of the story felt like an endless stretch of uncertainty. The group stayed in the safe house, their eyes glued to the TV and their phones, waiting for any sign that the network had retaliated, or worse, that they had been tracked down. Every car that drove by, every knock on the door, made their hearts race. But for the first time in weeks, they had a sense of accomplishment. The truth was out. The world knew. And no matter what happened next, they had done everything they could. But as the night wore on, the relief they felt slowly started to turn into tension. The initial buzz from the press had settled, and there were still no immediate signs that the network was striking back. It was unsettling, this quiet in the aftermath. The group was on high alert, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing, that the calm before the storm was only temporary. The journalist paced back and forth, her mind running 100 miles an hour. "We've exposed them," she muttered, almost to herself. "But we still don't have enough. We need more. We need the final piece to put them down for good." They had the names, the connections, the dark operations, but without the final key, the proof that would tie everything together and ensure that the network would be taken down for good, it would all be for nothing. And they couldn't afford to fail now. What's the next move? One of the volunteers asked, their voice steady but tinged with unease. We've got the press, but if we don't have enough evidence to back it up, it's all just words. We can't risk everything without a solid case. The journalist stopped pacing and looked at them, her eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and determination. We need to track down the people at the top, the ones who really pull the strings, the ones who've been operating in the shadows this whole time. If we can get to them, we can collapse the whole thing. The volunteer nodded. How do we find them? That's the hard part, the journalist admitted. They've covered their tracks well, but there's always a way in. There's always a crack in the wall. We just need to find it. The group fell silent, each person lost in their thoughts, try to come up with a solution. They had been so focused on getting the story out, on exposing the network to the public, that they hadn't fully considered the next steps. Now, with the press picking up on the story, they needed to be strategic. The network would be circling back, looking to cover up their operations, and they couldn't afford to let that happen. We have to act fast, the journalist said, breaking the silence. The longer we wait, the more time they have to erase their tracks. We can't let them spin this story. We have to stay ahead. The volunteers nodded. They couldn't sit idly by and wait for the network to strike first. They had the momentum now. It was time to use it. Hours passed as the group scrambled to track down more information. They reached out to their remaining contacts, hoping to get a lead on who was behind the operations. They dug deeper into the files, analyzing every detail, looking for that final piece of the puzzle. But as the day wore on, there were still no concrete answers. It wasn't until late into the night, when the group was about to give up for the evening, that a breakthrough came. One of the volunteers had found a hidden document, one that hadn't caught their attention before. It was buried deep in the files, but it was a treasure trove of information. It was a ledger detailing payments, transfers, and meetings between key figures in the network. And among those names was one that stood out, a high-ranking official in the government, someone with a reputation for keeping a low profile. That's it, the journalist whispered as she looked at the name. This is the piece we've been missing. The group gathered around the table, looking at the document. This was the lead they needed. The person who had been at the heart of the operation, the one with the power to move the pieces and protect the network from exposure. They had the evidence, and now they could prove the network's connections to the highest levels of government. But there was a problem. The official's name was linked to dozens of secretive accounts and meetings, but they couldn't go public with this information just yet. They needed to get more proof that this person was truly at the top of the network. Without that, they would risk exposing themselves without being able to back it up. The network would have enough time to erase everything they had worked so hard to uncover. The group worked together, pulling the threads together, and within hours, they had what they needed, a clear paper trail linking the official to the criminal activities of the network. It was airtight. It was everything they had hoped for, and it was enough to ensure the network would be exposed for good. But there was no time to waste. The official would have already caught wind of the press coverage, and they wouldn't hesitate to destroy any evidence of their involvement. The group was now in a race against time. We need to get this to the authorities, one of the volunteers said. We've got the evidence. We can't do this alone anymore. It's time to take it to the people who can make this official. But the journalist shook her head. The authorities? We can't trust them. Not with this. We have to take it straight to the media. They'll have to act once it's out in the open. The public will force their hand. The decision was made. They would go public with the final piece of evidence. This was the moment of truth. They couldn't afford to hesitate. And as they prepared to send the evidence to the media, one final thought lingered in their minds. Once they exposed the highest levels of power, there would be no turning back. The network wouldn't go down quietly. They would be hunted, but there was no other option. The truth had to come out, and whatever happened next, they would stand by it together. The final decision had been made. They were about to send the explosive evidence to the media. But even as the files were uploaded, there was a palpable sense of dread in the room. Every second felt like a countdown. They were exposing the most powerful figure in the network, someone whose connections spread far and wide, someone who could very well orchestrate their destruction before dawn. But they had come too far to turn back. The truth had to come out. The journalist, her hands shaking slightly as she typed, looked up at the group. Once this goes out, there's no going back. The network will do everything in their power to bury this. They'll be after us in minutes. The tension was thick. Each of them, though resolute, couldn't help but feel the weight of the storm they were about to unleash. They were about to expose a corrupt official, an individual so entrenched in the system. It would be nearly impossible to undo the damage they had done. The network wouldn't stop until they had silenced everyone involved. But this was it, the moment they had been working toward. The files were sent, the story was out there, and now all they could do was wait. For a few minutes, there was nothing. The silence in the room seemed to stretch out, an unbearable void between what they had done and the reaction they feared. And then, as if on cue, the notifications began to ping. The story hit the headlines. Government official linked to global criminal network. Scandal rocks political establishment. The group stared at the screen, the words sinking in. They had done it. The truth was out. The media was running with the story. But even as they read the headlines, their hearts sank. This was only the beginning. The network would not go down without a fight. They would be coming for them, for the journalist, for everyone involved. They had exposed the heart of the operation, but it was clear that the battle had only just begun. "We need to move fast," the journalist said, breaking the silence. "They'll come for us now. It's only a matter of time before they try to bury this." The group had no time to celebrate. There was no relief, no moment of triumph. Instead, they immediately began making preparations to protect themselves. They couldn't stay in the safe house any longer. It was compromised, and they knew that the network would be tracing every lead, looking for anyone involved in the leak. "What's the plan?" one of the volunteers asked, pacing around, trying to think of their next move. "First, we get out of the city," the journalist said, her voice calm but firm. "We can't stay here with all the attention now. We need to lay low, stay off the grid. But we can't stop now. We've got the media's attention, and that's our lifeline. We need to keep feeding them information, keep pushing. The more they know, the harder it will be for the network to bury us." They moved quickly, packing up their things, making sure they had the critical files, the evidence, and their phones. As they prepared to leave, there was a sense of urgency that hadn't been there before. They were no longer just pursuing the truth. They were running from the very people they had exposed. As the car sped away from the city, the weight of the situation pressed on them. The authorities were watching. The network was watching. And now, so was the world. But the question remained, would it be enough? Would the story gain enough traction to destroy the network? Or would they be silenced before they could finish what they had started? The journalist remained quiet, her eyes focused on the road ahead. They couldn't afford to make a wrong move. They had no allies, only the truth and the fragile hope that the media would follow through. They could only hope that the public would rise up, that enough pressure could be put on the authorities to act before the network buried the truth forever. As they made their way out of the city, the group was faced with the harsh reality that they had started something much bigger than they could have ever imagined. The network was vast, its reach far beyond what they had expected, and now they had put a target on their backs. They were now not just trying to save Jimmy, they were trying to stop an operation that spanned continents, one that had been hiding in plain sight for far too long. And as the car drove further away from the city lights, the group exchanged one last look, each of them understanding that their lives had just changed irrevocably. They weren't just fugitives now, they were the last line of defense, the ones who had uncovered the truth. They had to keep moving, they had to keep fighting, and no matter what happened, they would not let the network win. The storm was coming, but they were ready. The next few days were a blur of frantic motion, unease, and constant vigilance. They had left the city behind, but their journey was far from over. The world had shifted. The media was buzzing with the scandal, and the network's retaliation was swift and relentless. They couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. Each new location was a temporary refuge, a brief breath before they had to move again. The journalist, despite her calm exterior, seemed more tense than ever. She had been through dangerous assignments before, but this was different. The stakes were higher. The network wasn't just a criminal syndicate. It was an empire built on secrecy and power, one that wasn't about to let a few brave individuals threaten everything they had built. And now, it wasn't just the network chasing them. It was the authorities too, as the lines between the corrupt officials and the criminals grew blurrier by the minute. "We're running out of time," the journalist muttered one evening as they set up their temporary hideout in yet another anonymous hotel room. "The pressure's mounting. We need to keep the story alive, but they're closing in on every lead. We can't let them silence us." The group nodded grimly. They had all been running on adrenaline, but as the days passed, the exhaustion was beginning to take its toll. They had fought so hard to get to this point, but with every new piece of the puzzle, the dangers seemed to escalate. They were surrounded, and they could feel it, like the walls were slowly closing in. The phone calls from the press were becoming more frequent, but they were also becoming more strained. The network had already begun its counterattack. They were spreading misinformation, accusing the group of fabricating the story, discrediting their efforts, and creating false narratives to turn the public against them. It was an uphill battle to maintain any semblance of credibility. But through it all, there was one thing they could rely on: the evidence. The files they had uncovered were irrefutable, and the story had too much momentum now. The media wasn't backing down. They had the public's attention, and that was something the network couldn't control. Not entirely, at least. One evening, as they sat around a table in their latest hideout, the volunteer who had first spoken of fear and doubt spoke up again. "We need to get to the person at the very top," he said, voice low but determined. "We've exposed their operations, we've exposed their corruption, but we haven't taken down the heart of it yet. We need to go after the one who's really pulling the strings, the one who set this all in motion." The group looked at each other, the realization dawning on them. They knew they couldn't rest until they had taken down the network's leader. It wasn't just about justice for Jimmy anymore. It was about dismantling the system that had allowed this to happen in the first place. But they also knew that going after the head of the network would mean crossing an even more dangerous line. They had already seen the lengths to which the network would go to protect itself. This was a battle they could win only if they were willing to risk everything. The journalist nodded slowly, her gaze sharp as she assessed the group. "We can't wait any longer," she said. "We have the truth, but we need to make sure it sticks. We need to expose the entire operation, and we need to go after them at their core." They all knew what that meant. It meant going deeper into the heart of the network, finding the leader who had masterminded it all. And it meant doing so under the watchful eye of those who would do anything to protect their empire. The plan was set in motion the next day. They would use the media coverage to their advantage, working with trusted journalists who had stayed loyal to the cause. It wasn't just about exposing a single person, it was about taking down the entire system. They would find the connections, tie up the loose ends, and push the story until it was impossible to ignore. But even as they prepared, a sinking feeling lingered in the back of their minds. They knew what they were up against. They had seen the network's reach, felt its power, and knew they couldn't afford to make a mistake. The authorities might be part of the corruption, but the media could still help if they played it carefully. "We need to move fast," one of the volunteers said, his eyes narrowing in determination. "They're not going to wait for us to make our next move. If we're going to get the leader, we need to take them down while we still can." The tension was palpable, but there was no turning back. They had come too far to let fear stop them now. They had uncovered the heart of the operation, and now they were going to bring it to its knees. As the days passed, the pieces of the puzzle slowly started to fall into place. They tracked the leader's movements, found their connections, and slowly built a case that could bring the entire network to justice. They couldn't do it alone, but they had allies, loyal journalists, trusted sources, and even some members of the public who had begun to support their cause. The battle was far from over, but they were no longer just hiding in the shadows. They were out in the open, fighting for the truth. And with every step, they knew they were getting closer to bringing down the network once and for all. The storm was far from over, but now they had the momentum, and with that momentum, they had a chance to win. The following days were a blur of movement, strategy, and constant updates from the media. The group was no longer confined to hiding in dark corners. They had become part of a larger movement now, one that was spreading quickly across the globe. The truth about the network was reaching more and more people every hour. The public was growing restless, hungry for justice, and that pressure was beginning to weigh heavily on the network itself. They could feel the walls closing in. But even as the story gained more traction, there was a lingering unease. The group couldn't help but feel like they were being watched at all times. They had gone public, exposed the deepest secrets of a criminal empire, and now they were the ones being hunted. Every knock on the door, every sound in the hallway sent their hearts racing. "We can't let up now," the journalist said, her voice sharp as she looked over the latest news coverage. "The moment we take our foot off the gas, they'll regain control. We can't let that happen." The group knew the stakes were higher than ever. They had built a fragile momentum, one that could easily be undone by a single mistake. But with each passing hour, they grew more determined. They had seen the faces of the people whose lives had been ruined by this network, and they couldn't back down. Not now. Not when the truth was finally on the verge of being fully exposed. The group continued to push forward, working tirelessly to gather even more evidence, to dig deeper into the network's operations. They contacted former members, people who had escaped the network's grasp, and found more pieces of the puzzle. Each new discovery brought them closer to the network's leader, the one who had started it all, the one who had orchestrated the chaos. "We need to move on the leader," one of the volunteers said, his voice heavy with urgency. "They're hiding, but we got enough to take them down. We can't let them slip through our fingers." The journalist nodded in agreement. "We've got their attention now. We can't afford to wait. The pressure's building, and the authorities are already on their way to make arrests. If we get to the leader before they do, we could bring this whole thing down." But there was a catch. The network's leader wasn't just hiding. They were protected by layers of security, layers of power that stretched far beyond what the group had anticipated. Every move they made had to be calculated. One wrong step, and everything they had worked for could be destroyed. "We've done everything we can," the journalist said, her eyes focused. "We've exposed their connections, we've exposed their lies, but we need the final piece. We need to show the world exactly who's been behind all of this. And once we do, we'll have enough leverage to bring them down." The group worked late into the night, reviewing the evidence they had gathered, strategizing their next steps. They knew the moment they exposed the leader's identity to the public, they would be at the center of storm. But it wasn't about the danger they faced anymore. It was about the truth, about making sure the network didn't escape, about giving Jimmy and all the other victims a voice. By morning, they had it. The missing piece. The connection that would expose the leader of the network. The one who had orchestrated everything from behind the scenes. It was the final link they needed to complete the chain of evidence, to make sure the leader couldn't escape justice. The journalist looked at the group, her expression resolute. We do this now. We release everything. We expose the leader, and we make sure the authorities can't cover it up. We can't let them slip away. The group, weary but resolute, nodded in agreement. They had no other choice. This was their moment, the moment they had been waiting for. The storm that had been brewing was finally here, and they would ride it out no matter the cost. They took one final look at the evidence, ensuring everything was in place. Then, with one decisive click, the story went live. The world would know the truth. The network's leader would be exposed for all to see, their grip on the world unraveling in real time. The response was immediate. The press exploded with the new revelations, and soon, it was everywhere, on every news channel, every social media feed. The leader's identity was out, and the web of corruption that had kept them in power was collapsing. The authorities scrambled to respond, but the pressure from the public was overwhelming. The network's downfall had begun, but as the story broke, the group couldn't help but feel a sense of dread settle over them. They had won this battle, but the war wasn't over. The network wouldn't go down without a fight. They would stop at nothing to protect their empire. The phone rang. The journalist picked it up, her face growing pale as she listened. "They know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They know we're coming for them, and they're making their move." The group braced themselves. The moment they had been preparing for had arrived. The network was striking back, and they had to stay ahead of the storm. "We move fast," the journalist said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We don't let them win." The fight had reached its climax. The network was on the defensive, but the group knew it wasn't over. There was no time to waste. They had to finish what they had started, and they had to do it before the network buried them all. The world was unraveling before their eyes. The network, cornered by the flood of media coverage and public scrutiny, had started to push back with a ferocity that sent shockwaves through the group. They had been expecting retaliation, but not with the speed and precision that the network now demonstrated. The phone call that had shaken them was only the beginning. Every minute felt like an eternity as the storm they had set in motion began to pick up speed. The safe house, once a place of refuge, now felt more like a cage. Every corner felt too exposed. Every movement felt too risky. They had made the decision to expose the network's leader, and now, with the world's eyes on them, they were more vulnerable than ever. "We need to move," the journalist said, her voice strained with urgency. "They'll be coming for us. If we stay here, we'll be sitting ducks." The group gathered their things quickly, throwing together whatever they could carry. The files, the evidence, the phones, all of it was vital, but so was their safety. There was no time to plan, no time to hesitate. They had to go on the run again, but this time they were ready. They couldn't afford to be caught off guard. They had been exposed, and they knew it was only a matter of time before the network closed in. As they stepped out into the night, the weight of what they had done settled over them. They had taken the fight to the network, and they had revealed the truth. But now they were the ones in danger. They were the hunted. The city seemed alive with threats, the bustling streets and flashing lights hiding the lurking danger. They had to keep moving, stay unpredictable. The more people who knew about the case, the more they became targets. The group couldn't afford to trust anyone they hadn't already worked with. Every phone call, every meeting, every new face was a potential risk. "We've done what we can," one of the volunteers said, their voice tight with fear but steady. "Now, it's in the hands of the authorities. They have the power to stop this. We've given them everything they need to end it." The journalist shook her head, her eyes dark with the knowledge of the reality they faced. We can't rely on them. The authorities are compromised. They won't move fast enough, and if they do, the network will just cover it up. We have to keep pushing. The media, the public, they're the only thing that can keep the pressure on. The group nodded, understanding that they couldn't stop now. The network wasn't just going to disappear, and neither could they. They had to keep up the momentum, even if it meant living on the run. For the next few days, they kept moving, constantly changing locations, always a step ahead of the forces trying to find them. They sent out encrypted messages to the journalists they trusted, feeding them more information, making sure the story stayed in the public eye. The network fought back, but it was clear they were rattled. The more the group revealed, the more cracks appeared in the network's armor. People were beginning to talk, and that was something the network couldn't control. But the fight wasn't over. The authorities, though slow to act, were now getting involved, albeit hesitantly. The group's work had ignited a firestorm, and the pressure on the corrupt officials within the system was starting to build. But they knew the clock was ticking. The network still had powerful people in its corner, and until those people were brought down, the battle would continue. One evening, as the group huddled in another temporary hideout, an anonymous tip came in. It was a breakthrough, a new lead. Someone within the network, someone close to the leader, had decided to come forward. They were willing to testify, willing to give up the final pieces that could bring the entire operation to its knees. "Is this real?" the journalist asked, her voice a mix of disbelief and hope. "Can we trust it?" The volunteer who had received the tip nodded, scanning the details. "This person knows everything. They've been inside for years. This could be the end of it." The hope was palpable, but so was the caution. The group knew better than to take anything at face value now. The network had spies everywhere. This tip could be genuine, or it could be another trap to lure them out. "We have to meet them," one volunteer said, determination hardening their voice. "If this is the break we've been waiting for, we can't afford to miss it." But even as they made plans to meet the informant, the journalist's phone buzzed. Another message, another threat. "You're running out of time," it read. "If you go forward with this, you'll be crossing a line you can't come back from." The group exchanged looks. They were already on the edge. They had crossed that line the moment they decided to expose the network. But they had no choice now. The truth was in their hands, and if they backed down, the entire operation would collapse around them. The meeting with the informant would happen. It had to. This was the final step. The network's leader was still untouchable, but with this information, they could bring them down for good. And so, the group prepared for one last push, one final effort to make sure the truth prevailed, no matter the cost. The anticipation in the air was electric as the group geared up for the meeting with the informant. This could be their final opportunity to bring down the network once and for all. The moment they had been working toward, sacrificing for, had finally arrived. Yet, despite the resolve that had carried them this far, an undercurrent of anxiety rippled through the group. Each of them knew the stakes, the risks, and the weight of the decision. They could feel the looming danger, but there was no turning back now. The informant's message had come through on an encrypted phone, a direct link to the heart of the network. This person, someone who had been involved for years, now wanted to testify. They knew everything, every name, every operation, every dirty deal. And yet, as the group prepared to meet them, the questions continued to linger. Was this a trap? A last-ditch effort by the network to bait them out? "We have no choice," the journalist said as they prepared to leave their temporary hideout. "If this person knows what they say they do, this is it. This could be the key to ending it all." The plan was simple. Meet at a location far from their current hideout, a place that offered some degree of anonymity. It was a nondescript cafe on the edge of town, crowded enough to blend in, yet quiet enough for a conversation to happen without drawing attention. But even as they made their way to the cafe, the weight of the situation pressed down on them. Every car that passed by, every person they crossed paths with, felt like a potential threat. The network had eyes everywhere, and they couldn't afford a single slip-up. They arrived at the cafe under the cover of darkness, a sharp contrast to the bustling, noisy surroundings. The group entered cautiously, scanning the room for any sign of the informant. No one stood out. The patrons were ordinary, unaware of the storm that had been set in motion. It was strange how normal everything felt when their lives had become anything but. They sat at a small table near the back, their eyes darting around as they waited. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. Their hearts were in their throats. Was this a trap? Was the informant already in danger? Was this the network's way of drawing them into a more vulnerable position? Then the door opened and a figure stepped inside. They wore a hat low over their eyes, their face obscured. The group tensed, but the figure didn't look at them. They scanned the room briefly before taking a seat at a table across the room, a spot that allowed them to keep an eye on the exits. A minute passed, and then the informant slowly stood and made their way toward the group, deliberately slow and careful. They were wearing a coat that hid most of their features, but their eyes were what gave them away. The cold, calculating look of someone who had lived through more than they should have, who had seen the ugliest sides of the world. They sat down without saying a word, their eyes scanning the group carefully. "You're sure about this?" The journalist asked quietly, leaning forward. "You understand the risks. If you're lying, if this is a setup, I'm not lying." The informant cut her off, their voice low and hushed. "I want out. I don't want to die for this. You have the evidence, but you need the names. You need the connections, and I can give them to you." The group held their breath, each one waiting for the next words to come. The informant wasn't just talking about small-time criminals. They were talking about the leader, the people who truly ran the operation. The information they had would confirm what they had suspected all along. "There's more," the informant said after a long pause, glancing around to ensure no one was paying attention. "I've seen what they're capable of. They've got the kind of reach that you don't even realize until it's too late. But you can't bring them down unless you go for the heart of the operation." The group leaned in closer, the urgency of the moment making them forget the danger around them. The leader is untouchable, on paper at least. They've covered their tracks well, but they're too close to the government. They've got connections in the highest places. This isn't just a criminal syndicate. This is a network that controls information, influences decisions, and silences anyone who dares get in their way. The informant looked over their shoulder, as if expecting someone to walk through the door at any moment. The network is preparing for a counterstrike. You might be the ones they target next. The group exchanged worried glances, but there was no time for hesitation. They had come too far to turn back now. "We're not backing down," the journalist said firmly. "You've given us the final piece. We'll make sure the world knows the truth. We'll make sure they don't get away with this." The informant nodded, a flicker of something like relief crossing their face. "I don't know how much time you have," they whispered urgently. "But if you're going after them, you need to do it now. The longer you wait, the harder it will be. They'll stop at nothing to protect themselves." With those final words, the informant stood up, glanced once more at the group, and then melted back in the crowd, disappearing just as quietly as they had arrived. The group sat still for a moment, absorbing the gravity of the situation. They had names. They had the final connection. But with the network aware of their every move, they knew they had to act fast. The informant had given them everything they needed, but now the real challenge began, getting the authorities, the media, and the public to take action before the network could strike back. They had no illusions about what lay ahead. The enemy they were facing was far more dangerous than anything they had prepared for. But they had the truth now, and with that truth, they had power. The only question was, could they use it before it was too late? The storm was about to hit full force. The group left the cafe, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that the final push was coming. The informant had given them the missing pieces they had been desperately searching for, but it wasn't enough just to know the truth. They had to act quickly, decisively. The network was no longer just a faceless enemy in the shadows. It had a name, a leader, and the full extent of its reach. And now, with the stakes higher than ever, they were the ones on the front lines, fighting to expose it all. The night was colder than usual as they made their way to their new hideout. Every step felt like a step deeper into enemy territory. The group was exhausted, physically and emotionally, but they were more determined than ever. The plan was simple: get the information to the authorities, get it to the media, and keep pushing. There was no other choice now. The network had been exposed, but they still had to finish what they had started. Once back at the safe house, the journalist began working immediately. She contacted her most trusted sources, confirming that the final evidence had been delivered and was being reviewed by the media. The names, the connections, the proof, it was all there. But the question remained: would anyone act on it before the network managed to cover its tracks? "We can't afford to wait," the journalist muttered as she typed out messages to her contacts, her fingers moving quickly over the keys. They'll move to erase this. They'll do anything to keep their empire intact. The volunteer who had become their unofficial leader turned to the group, his voice serious. "We need to get the authorities involved, but we can't trust everyone. We need to be careful about who we reach out to." One of the volunteers spoke up, voice uncertain but resolute. "We can't just sit here and hope it all works out. We need to get ahead of them. They're going to retaliate, we know that. But we need to find the ones who can help us bring this down for good. We need the right people on our side." The journalist nodded, already shifting her focus. "I'll keep the media pressure up. We can't let the story fade. The public's watching now. They won't let this go. But we need to be strategic with who we trust." The room fell silent as everyone began to process the enormity of the situation. They had exposed the network's leader. They had connected the dots between corrupt officials and criminal enterprises. But it wasn't enough. The next move was critical. They couldn't afford to let the story get buried under a smear campaign or a cover-up. They had to ensure that the story not only survived but thrived, gaining the momentum to spark real change. The hours passed, each one stretching out in a haze of uncertainty. They could feel the pressure mounting. Every news broadcast, every social media post was a reminder that they were now in the fight of their lives. Suddenly, the phone rang. It was a text message. The group's collective breath caught in their throats as the screen flashed. "They know. They're coming for you." The journalist's face paled as she read the message aloud. "They found us. It's starting. We need to get out of here. Now." The urgency in her voice sent the group into immediate action. They grabbed their things, documents, phones, anything they couldn't afford to leave behind, and scrambled toward the exit. The network's retaliation had begun. It wasn't just about stopping them anymore. It was about staying alive. "We have a few hours," the journalist said as she grabbed her coat and rushed to the door. "We need to get to the next safe location before they close in on us. Stay together. Don't split up. We can't risk being tracked." The group moved quickly, their minds racing as they exited the building, their footsteps echoing through the quiet streets. The city was alive with the usual buzz, but everything felt different now. Every car seemed like a potential threat. Every person they passed seemed to be watching. They couldn't afford to make a wrong move. They reached the car and sped off, the safe house now a distant memory. They had to stay one step ahead, and that meant not staying in any one place for too long. Their next move would be critical. They had to ensure the final evidence made it to the right people, the ones who could act swiftly and decisively. The car's headlights illuminated the empty roads ahead, but it felt like they were driving straight into the heart of the storm. The fight had reached its peak. The group had done everything they could to expose the network, but now the real battle began. Would they survive long enough to see justice done? Or would the network silence them before they could finish what they had started? "We keep moving," the journalist said, breaking the heavy silence. "We don't stop until it's done. We've come this far." The group nodded, their resolve unwavering. They had no choice but to keep going. The network had underestimated them before, but they were done running. They had the truth on their side, and now they would see it through to the end, no matter the cost. The storm was here, and they were ready to face it head on. The car sped down the darkened streets, its headlights slicing through the night as the group prepared for what they knew would be a relentless pursuit. The tension in the air was thick, and the weight of what was happening bore down on them. They had exposed the network, uncovered the identities of its leaders, and brought the truth to the world. But now the battle was no longer just about revealing secrets. It was about survival. "We're getting close," the journalist said quietly, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. She had been scanning for any signs of being followed for miles, but the streets seemed strangely empty. "We need to lay low for a while. The network is going to go into overdrive now. They won't stop until they silence us." The group exchanged worried glances. The media had picked up on the story, and it was spreading like wildfire. The pressure on the network was mounting, but so was the danger. The authorities, despite their apparent reluctance, were beginning to take action. The world was demanding answers, but the network had power. It had resources, and as the group had already learned, they would stop at nothing to protect their empire. "We need to get to the drop point," one of the volunteers said, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around them. "We have the documents, the evidence. Once it's in the right hands, we can stop running." The journalist nodded. "The authorities are finally making moves, but we need to make sure the right people are involved. If we go straight to them, it could be compromised. We need someone on the inside, someone who can guarantee that the information will get to the right place." They had set up a rendezvous with a trusted contact who had been working quietly behind the scenes to ensure the network's unraveling. They had done everything they could to expose the network's corruption, but now it was about ensuring that the final blow would land. And that meant being careful, strategic, and above all, quick. "We're almost there," the journalist murmured, her fingers drumming nervously against the dashboard. The tension inside the car was suffocating. Each passing second seemed like an eternity. They were on the edge of something big, but they could feel the darkness closing in. They were being hunted, and they knew that the moment they made contact with their informant, they'd be closer to the truth than ever before. But that was also the moment when everything could fall apart. As they turned onto a narrow, dimly lit street, the car slowed. The meeting spot was ahead, a quiet alley with a small, inconspicuous building at the end. It looked unremarkable, easy to miss, but it was exactly what they needed. A place that could offer them temporary refuge while they made their next move. The car came to a stop, and the group remained silent for a few moments, each of them mentally preparing for what was to come. They had pushed the network to its breaking point, but they weren't finished yet. The final pieces were still out there. "Stay alert," the journalist said as she unlocked the car doors. "We can't afford to be careless now." They stepped out of the car one by one, moving quickly and quietly into the alley. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic, the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. They made their way to the back entrance of the building, where their contact was waiting. As they entered, the door clicked shut behind them, and for the first time in days, the group allowed themselves to breathe. The contact was waiting inside, a familiar face in the chaos, someone they had been working with from the beginning. This person had been their eyes on the inside, helping them navigate the murky waters of corruption that had tied the network to the highest levels of power. "You made it," the contact said, their voice low but relieved. "The network's scrambling. The media's coverage is causing chaos, but they're coming for anyone involved. You're not safe here for long." "We know," the journalist replied, her tone firm. "But we have what we need. We just need to make sure it gets to the right people before it's too late." The contact nodded and led them to a secure room in the back of the building, where a computer was set up to upload the final evidence. The group gathered around, watching as the information was uploaded, encrypted, and sent off to the right channels. It wasn't just about exposing the network anymore. It was about bringing it down, piece by piece, and ensuring that the people responsible would be held accountable. As the information was transmitted, a message popped up on the screen. It was a simple one. "The authorities are already mobilizing. You've done your part. Now, you have to disappear." The words sent a chill through the group. They had known this was coming, but hearing it so bluntly made it real. They weren't just in danger anymore. They were marked. But they had already made their decision. They had done the right thing, and they weren't about to back down now. "We'll go dark," the journalist said, her voice unwavering. "We'll get out of here and disappear for a while. The story is out. The network's on its last legs. It's only a matter of time before they're finished." The group gathered their things one last time, moving quickly but methodically. They had done everything they could to expose the truth, to take down a criminal empire that had operated in the shadows for far too long. And now, it was time to disappear into the night, to go underground until it was safe to emerge again. They stepped back into the alley, the door shutting softly behind them. The world was changing, and they had helped make that happen. They had taken on the darkest corners of corruption, exposed the lies, and fought for justice. It wasn't over yet, but they had taken the first step. The storm wasn't over, but they had already won the war.